Good morning, everyone. Good to see you. And thank you, Tai Kozen, for, uh, for permitting me a moment to share some words. This morning, I'd like to chat about the Buddhist practice or Buddhist concept of aimlessness. You may or may not be familiar with aimlessness. It's one of what is referred to as the three doors of liberation. And I'll give a brief, very, very brief overview of all three of those, and then we can go into talking about what is aimlessness. What does that mean? I think it like emptiness is often misunderstood in our practice, and I'd like to demystify it together as a group if we can. So the three doors of liberation. The first, of course, is one that we're probably all familiar with, emptiness. Emptiness, of course, isn't necessarily a philosophy, but a description of a reality. Like, suppose you have two teacups. One is filled with tea, and one isn't. You describe the cup that doesn't have tea as empty. However, if you look very closely, what is it empty of? Perhaps it's empty of tea, but it's full of everything else. It's full of air and particles and all these things. And the cup itself is made up of other things. It's made up of clay and perhaps carbon from fire and all of these other things that make up that teacup. So emptiness isn't necessarily void or non-being. It's a representation of a whole, that something can't exist within isolation, if that makes sense. The second of the doors of liberation, and I apologize if I'm kind of skimming over these first two, but this will be helpful when we get to aimlessness, and we can kind of dive into it a little bit. The second one is sightlessness. We see this show up. We see all of these show up in the Heart Sutra. This one, of course, the liberation of sightlessness. Sight marks an appearance of something as form, right? Like physical form, something tangible. We recognize things based on that assignment to its form. But we're often fooled by the outer form of things. For instance, just as a great example, let's use the cloud as an example. If we're sitting in some grass and we're looking up at a cloud, we go, there's a cloud. However, if we wait long enough and are patient, we'll see that that cloud is transforming. Perhaps it's transforming to rain or to mist, perhaps snow or hail. And we can see that that cloud is transforming. So our assignment of the title cloud, its form, is a temporary assignment. It's in transition and will become something else at a different point. We may not even have time to observe it, but it is taking place, right? And lastly, the third door of liberation is aimlessness. It's a tricky word. I feel like I struggled with this when I started studying it, and I felt like the semantics of it were really hard for my brain. Same with emptiness. So aimlessness means not putting anything in front of yourself that you're in constant pursuit of. So what we're looking for, we often think is outside of ourselves. However, if we look very closely, it's been there the whole time. So concentrating on aimlessness releases us for this craving for a future event or a future situation. I will be happy when insert thing here. So aimlessness is the practice of being in a singular moment. It emphasizes freedom from clinging, grasping, as it were, in particular for extended goals or outcomes to situations. Um, of course, easier said than done, right? So when we focus on the singular moment or the present moment, rather than being driven by a future goal or ambitions or whatever it is, we can be here doing what we're doing. I also want to acknowledge that aimlessness doesn't necessarily mean lazy or being overly passive in something, but rather releasing this desire to constantly pursue something outside of ourselves for fulfillment, for happiness. Um, if we look very closely, we can see that that's there, and it's been there the whole time. A great, one of my favorite quotes is, "I have never been lost because I've never had a destination." So if we look very closely at this idea of aimlessness, we can see that all of the conditions necessary for happiness are already here. We don't have to attain a point of which we reach happiness. Instead, we uncover the things that hide it. So, in essence, aimlessness is a practice of letting go of this constant cycle of wanting, of striving, of seeking to attain. It's recognizing that our happiness isn't heavily dependent on some future goal or mental state, but instead we can find contentment, we can find happiness, we can find joy within this moment. Will this moment also be populated with other emotions? Yes. Will it also be populated with other experiences? Yes. So aimlessness is recognizing that we aren't experiencing one thing at a time. How often are we feeling sorrowful and also feeling grateful? Or how often are we feeling lonesome while also feeling loving? So we can have these a multitude of experiences at one time. I also want to acknowledge that, coming back to something that we touched on earlier, aimlessness doesn't mean a lack of purpose or direction, right? It's not, la la la, I'm just going to go this way and that way, and running into walls everywhere, right? Um, it means approaching whatever it is that we're doing, with whatever activity, without being hyper fixated on a specific outcome, and embracing that often the journey is better than the destination, or that there's a great deal to learn in that journey, right? So finding fulfillment in the now, right? So it allows us to discover the joy that's already in this moment and be fulfilled in it. That's not easy. And by recognizing that when we're seeking, when we're clinging, we're often not able to see what's right there in front of us, right? If we're looking at the horizon, we may not see um, the beautiful flock of deer that just walked into our field of vision. Instead, we're focused way out here on the sunset, and we're not seeing everything else that's taking place. Both are beautiful. However, we can observe the whole. The other day, I was lying in bed. I hadn't slept great. As you know, I have a lot of pets, and they like to play during the night. And so I hadn't slept well, and so I had woken up and I was lying in bed, and I was very warm and comfy, and I had a cat on me, and it was really great. And I was laying there, and I was thinking to myself, am I practicing aimlessness in this moment? Am I aimless in that I'm not rushing to get out of bed? And as I looked deeply into that question, I realized that I was clinging. I wasn't aimless at all. I was clinging and was attached to the comfortable, peaceful moment. I was attached to the kitten in my arms. I was attached to the warm blanket and the fluffy bed. And so in that moment, I got out of bed and tried to approach my morning with more aimlessness. Now, I think it's important to be flexible in that and recognize that we are practicing the middle way, right? And not to be overly rigid in any one particular way. However, these practices can be very helpful, like it suggests, to our liberation, to awakening, meaning uncovering all of these things that are barriers to seeing what is right here at this very moment for the beautiful thing that it is. And the lesson that is within each moment, even when it's very difficult to see it. I want to also talk about that aimlessness is not the same as desirelessness. Right? This isn't the complete absence of desire. I think it's important to note that aimlessness, it's a little different. While aimlessness encourages the release of unhealthy desires, it also doesn't mean suppressing all of our desires. Instead, it's transforming the nature of our desires from grasping and clinging and all this stuff, craving, to a release, a wisdom, and a compassion in those desires. The desire to help, the desire to be there for someone, the desire to be there for ourselves, right? When we hear in the noble, why am I forgetting? The Four Noble Truths, forgive me. When we see that desire is the source of our suffering, we can observe that that clinging is the source of our suffering, right? That wanting things to be different than they are is that source of suffering. And to also recognize that there will be desire. The Bodhisattva path is one that is rooted in some level of desire, a desire to help, the desire to liberate both ourselves and all those that we encounter. So reminding ourselves that aimlessness isn't an eradication of hope or any of this. Instead, it's an embracing of that compassionate, wise desire, while also not getting overly focused on the destination. We often use a metaphor in Buddhism, going to the other shore, the shore of awakening. And it's often when someone steps their foot onto that shore, they realized both shores were the same shore the whole time. That samsaric loop, or that habit behavior, was their path to liberation or nirvana. That they were one and the same. That when we drink our cup of tea, that we hold the entirety of the universe right there in our hands. It's all right there. We don't have to travel on a spaceship through space to find the universe. We can simply find it in the eyes of a friend, in a cup of tea, in the meow of a kitten or under a blanket, in the faces of our friends that we see once a week. And we can practice this deep practice of aimlessness by listening to our friend in the way that they need to be listened to, not in the hopes of fixing their problem, not in the hopes of completely eradicating what it is that they're going through, but instead by being fully with them in that moment without any concern with that end point. And if we can do that for ourselves, for others, in this example, we may find great healing, great opening. So I invite all of us to explore these. We often talk about emptiness. This is one that we come back to regularly, right, in our group. Very rarely do we talk about the other two. So I invite us to explore these. Go online, do some reading, listen to a podcast, go buy a beautiful book by Thich Nhat Hanh or another gorgeous author, Pema Chodron, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Maybe even someone that is not Buddhist, I'm sure, has beautiful things to say about this. And see how this shows up in your life and how these practices may be used or implemented in your day-to-day life in a way that you can begin to be here, that we can begin to be here at this moment and not somewhere else. So these are my words for this morning.